The Red Dragon Pack came seeking slaughter, but found their hatchlings sleeping peacefully on a human. The scent of blood on the wind. The Red Dragon Pack did not negotiate, they did not send warnings, they simply came. 14 of them descended from the Asheville Mountains like a living storm, scales the color of burning coals catching the last dying light of the sun as they swept low over the treeline. Koreth, their alpha, ancient, scarred, with horns that had been broken and regrown twice over, led the formation with his neck stretched long and his eyes fixed on the valley below. The human settlement, the place where 3 of their hatchlings had gone missing 4 days ago. 4 days was long enough to grieve, long enough to let rage fill the hollow spaces left behind. The pack had found the trail easily enough. Tiny claw marks in the mud near the river's edge, scales no bigger than a man's thumbnail snagged on low bramble, and the unmistakable sulfur-sweet scent of young ones who had not yet learned to mask their presence. The trail had led here, directly here, to the cluster of stone and timber buildings nestled against the hillside, smoke curling from chimneys, lanterns beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Koreth had seen human settlements burn before. He had watched them collapse inward, watched the stones crack from heat, watched the people scatter like beetles from an overturned rock. He felt no particular satisfaction in the memory, but he felt no hesitation either. If his hatchlings had been harmed, if even one scale had been forcibly removed, if even one small talon had been clipped for some collector's trophy, he would reduce this place to ash and remember it only as a lesson to the next village downstream. The pack descended. They came in low over the outer fields, close enough that the draft from their wings flattened the wheat and sent chickens scattering in shrieking explosions of feathers. A woman drawing water from a well looked up and dropped her bucket. A man repairing a fence simply sat down in the grass, all the strength gone from his legs at once. Children who had been playing near the road ran without screaming because screaming required breath, and there was no breath left in the valley. Koreth landed in the center of the village square with a force that cracked the old cobblestones beneath him. The rest of the pack fanned out behind him, wings half spread, a wall of red and gold and terrible intent. He drew himself up to his full height, and his shadow swallowed 3 buildings whole. "Bring out what belongs to us," he said, and his voice was the sound a mountain makes when it decides to stop being patient. Part 2: What the Alpha Found. No one ran, that surprised him. They were afraid Koreth could smell it, the sharp metallic bite of fear hanging over the square like weather, but they held their ground. An older man with a white beard and a walking staff stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his chin lifted with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that if he is going to die, he will die standing straight. Behind him, a younger woman with flowers still on her hands moved to stand at his side without being asked. "We know why you've come," the old man said. His voice only shook a little. "We were going to send word, we were trying to find someone who spoke your tongue." Koreth lowered his head until his eyes were level with the man, close enough that each exhale sent the elder's white hair streaming backward. "My tongue requires no translation. Where are they?" "Inside," the woman with flower on her hand said, and she pointed to the building behind her, a long, low structure that might have been a granary once, now clearly used as something else. Its doors were open. Lamplight spilled warm and golden from within. "The big one is with them, he hasn't left since the second night." The pack stirred the big one. Koreth held up one claw and they stilled. He moved to the doorway. It was too small for him, far too small, so he tore the upper portion of the doorframe away without particular malice, simply removed it the way one removes an obstacle, and ducked inside. What he saw stopped him as completely as a stone wall. On a wide bed of straw and folded blankets in the far corner, a human man lay sleeping on his back. He was large by human standards, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and hands that were heavily calloused. He was deeply, thoroughly, completely asleep, the kind of sleep that belongs to someone who has not slept properly in days and has finally surrendered to it. Draped across him were 3 hatchlings. Pyron, the boldest of the 3 and the one most likely to wander, was curled in a tight circle on the man's chest, her chin resting on her own tail, rising and falling gently with his breathing. Sult, the smallest, had wedged himself under the man's arm and pressed his snout against the man's ribs as though listening for something reassuring within. And Thessaly, quiet, cautious Thessaly, who had never in her young life willingly approached anything unfamiliar, was sprawled fully across the man's legs with the absolute boneless contentment of a creature who has decided she is exactly where she belongs. All 3 were breathing slowly, all 3 were warm, all 3 were whole. Koreth stood in the ruined doorway for a long moment. The rage that had carried him down from the mountains was still present, technically. He was aware of it, but it had nowhere to go. It turned over once heavily like a large animal in shallow water, and then it went still. On the floor beside the bed, he noticed the small details that accumulated into a story. A bowl that had held water, now empty and licked clean. Scraps of cloth used as makeshift bandaging. Pyron had a cut on her left forepaw, he saw now healed and clean. The man's own outer coat was draped over Salt and Thessaly like a blanket. There were dark circles under the sleeping man's eyes even in sleep, and his shoulders held the particular tension of someone who had been holding very still for a very long time so as not to disturb something precious. Behind Korath, the rest of the pack had gathered as close as they could, peering over and around him, because the Alpha had stopped moving and none of them knew why. Thessaly opened one golden eye. She looked at Korath. She yawned a slow, enormous, entirely unbothered yawn that showed all of her small teeth, and then she closed her eye again and tucked her snout back under the man's knee. Part 3: The Reckoning That Wasn't. Korath withdrew from the doorway slowly. The village square was still and waiting. The old man with the staff had not moved, neither had the woman with the flower on her hands. Neither had any of the others who stood in a loose half-circle behind them, 100 held breaths all at once. The pack watched their Alpha. They watched him stand with his back to the building, looking out over the square and the darkening sky above it, and they waited for the signal that would tell them what kind of night this was going to be. It was a long wait. Korath turned to the old man. How long has he been in there? Since the first night, the elder said carefully. We found the little ones in the river. The current had them. They came down from the high pass during the rainstorm. Marin pulled 2 of them out himself and went back for the 3rd. He had them warm and settled before any of us understood what they were. A pause. We understood what they were by the 2nd morning. And he stayed. He was afraid to move them. The woman's voice was steady now. He said if he moved and one of them woke frightened something might happen to the village, he thought it was better to wait. A ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite not. He's been awake for most of it, he only went under this evening. Korath was quiet for a moment longer. Around him, his pack had settled, wings folding, postures shifting from the language of violence into something else, something without a clean name. The small one's forepaw, Korath said. River rock, Marin cleaned it and wrapped it. He was very careful. The elder hesitated, then added, because he was a man who had survived long enough to know when the full truth was the safest offering. He talked to them through all of it. We could hear him. He didn't know what he was saying or if they could understand, but he talked to them anyway, about nothing, about the weather and the harvest and a horse he had as a boy. Another pause. They settled whenever he did. The pack did not speak. Several of them looked at one another in the sideways way that meant something was being communicated that had no need of words. Korath lowered himself to the ground, fully, completely, the great bulk of him settling onto the cobblestones of the square with a sound like a slow landslide. It was not the posture of a creature preparing to strike. It was the posture of a creature that has decided to remain somewhere for a while. We will wait, he said simply. So they waited. The red dragon pack settled into the village square like a weather event that had chosen to be gentle. The people of the village, after a period of rigid uncertainty, began to move again cautiously at first, then with the quiet practicality of people who have decided that extraordinary circumstances still require ordinary tasks. Someone brought water. Someone else, in a decision that would be told and retold for generations, brought a basket of salted fish to the edge of the square and left it there without making eye contact with anyone. It was nearly midnight when the sound came from inside the building, a sharp, bright chirp, the particular noise a hatchling makes upon waking in an unfamiliar place and finding it somehow familiar anyway. Then 2 more voices joining it. Then a low, drowsy human sound, the kind a person makes when they are being pulled from deep sleep by small, insistent weights moving around on top of them. Then, after a moment, the man's voice, rough with exhaustion, soft with something else, saying something calm and unhurried in the way he apparently said everything. All 3 hatchlings answered him at once. Korath listened to the sound of his young ones and closed his eyes briefly against something that had no name in any language he knew, that particular overwhelming relief that lives on the other side of a fear you were not ready to survive. He breathed it in. He let it go. When Marin finally appeared in the ruined doorway with all 3 hatchlings climbing over his shoulders and Thessaly already attempting to eat his hair, the man took in the sight of 14 red dragons filling his village square and went very, very still. Pyron chirped at him from his left shoulder, impatient, and bumped her head against his jaw. He looked down at her, he looked back up at Korath. Korath regarded him for a long moment, this large, tired, calloused human man who had stayed awake for 3 days in a room with dragon hatchlings, because he thought it was better to wait. You kept them warm, the Alpha said. The man swallowed. I tried to. You kept them whole. Oh yes. Korath inclined his head. It was a small gesture for a creature his size. For what it meant, it was enormous. Then you are known to us, the Alpha said, in all mountains, in all passes, in all places where the red pack flies. He held the man's gaze so the words would settle properly. You will not be forgotten. Marin opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Pyron, apparently done with the solemnity of the moment, sneezed a small jet of flame directly onto the top of his head, which caused a brief and undignified scramble, which caused the youngest pack member, barely older than a hatchling herself, to make a sound that was almost certainly a laugh. And the night, which had arrived full of fire and reckoning, passed instead into something quieter and stranger and far more permanent. What the Alpha found. No one rans. That surprised him. Korath had spoken his 6 words into the square and let the silence after them do its work, and he had expected the silence to produce the usual results. The breaking of whatever collective stillness had held the crowd, the scattering, the instinctive dispersal of prey that knows itself to be prey and acts accordingly. He had not expected anything as organized as standing their ground, and yet that was precisely what the people of the valley did. They stood. They held. They looked back at him with their fear written plainly on every face and in every held shoulder and whitened knuckle, and they did not run. He was aware that he found this notable. He filed it away in the part of his mind that accumulated observations about humans, a part that was, after centuries, quite full, but never seemed to reach capacity. The fear was real. He was not misreading it, was not confusing the smell of determination for the absence of terror, because the two were not mutually exclusive, and he knew this from long experience. The sharp metallic bite of adrenaline hung over the square like its own weather system, a low front that had moved in and settled and showed no signs of departing. He could taste it on the back of his tongue when he breathed. Could feel it in the quality of the air, which had the particular tight, overpressurized quality that large numbers of frightened people in an enclosed space will produce. Every instinct these humans possessed, every very sensible piece of biological wisdom encoded in their small, warm, rapidly beating bodies was telling them to run, and they were refusing to listen to it. There was a kind of courage in that which Korath could not dismiss. Even now, even standing in their square with his shadow swallowing their rooftops, and the cracked cobblestones still settling beneath his feet. He was still nodding this, still processing the shape of it, when the crowd moved. The old man came forward, as though he had been the one waiting for Korath to finish speaking rather than the other way around. He was not a young man, that was the first and most obvious thing. The white of his beard and the particular economy of movement that the very old develop when they have learned not to spend energy on gestures that serve no practical purpose. He had a walking staff, dark wood, worn smooth at the grip from years of daily use, and he moved with it the way some people move with a familiar tool, not leaning on it heavily, but keeping it close, a long habit of contact that had become simply part of how he occupied space. His back was straight. Not rigidly straight, not the straightness of someone performing bravery for an audience, but the straightness of a man whose spine had decided, somewhere in the long accumulation of his years, that it would hold the line regardless of what was happening around it. His chin was up. That detail, for reasons Korath could not entirely articulate, was the most affecting. It is a very human gesture, the lifted chin. It is the face presenting itself fully, refusing to angle away, refusing the small self-protective instinct to make oneself less visible to the thing that might destroy you. It is the gesture of someone who has completed a specific internal calculation and arrived at a specific conclusion, which is, I cannot make this better by making myself smaller, so I will not make myself smaller. He had the look of a man who had decided something. Not a comfortable decision, not a decision that had come easily, but a completed one. Behind him, without being asked, without any visible signal passing between them, a younger woman stepped forward to stand at his side. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor work and whether into something more angular than softness. She had flour on her hands, both hands, worked into the creases of her knuckles and caught under her nails, the flour of someone interrupted mid-task by something that required immediate and complete attention. She had not stopped to clean her hands. She had simply come, flour and all, because something had needed doing and she had decided to do it. These two people stood before him in the cracked square, and the 60 behind them held the line as well, and Korath waited. We know why you've come, the elder said. His voice was controlled with the specific precision of a person exercising conscious authority over something that would rather not be controlled. It shook. Korath heard it, the slight unevenness in the lower register of the man's speech that betrayed the effort the steadiness was costing him, but it shook only a little, and it did not break, and it did not hurry. He spoke as a man speaks when he has decided the words matter and therefore the delivery matters. We were going to send word. A pause, brief, the pause of a man choosing his next phrase with care rather than simply reaching for the nearest available one. We were trying to find someone who spoke your tongue. Korath regarded him. He lowered his head, a movement he controlled precisely, bringing his eyes level with the man rather than angling them down at him, the difference between looking at something and looking down upon it, and Korath chose the former deliberately. His head was still enormous at this distance. His exhale still moved the elder's white hair like a slow private wind. He was close enough that if the man had reached out his staff, the tip would have touched the scales of Korath's jaw. The man did not reach out his staff. "My tongue requires no translation," Korath said, and his voice at this range and this volume was something that moved through the elder's chest as much as his ears, a vibration that inhabited the body as well as the mind. "Where are they?" Something moved across the old man's face. Not relief, not quite, but the near cousin of relief, the expression of a person who has been carrying a very specific dread for a period of time and has just received confirmation that the thing they were dreading has arrived and can therefore now be dealt with. Anticipation is often more punishing than arrival. The old man seemed to know this. He opened his mouth, but it was the woman with flour on her hands who answered first. She pointed. The building she indicated sat at the edge of the square, long and low, its roofline slightly irregular in the way of structures that have been repaired multiple times by multiple hands over many years, each repair done with whatever material was nearest rather than whatever material matched. It might have been a granary once. It had that particular breadth and squat solidity of a building designed to hold large quantities of something heavy and to hold it reliably through all seasons. Its large double doors stood open. Not ajar, not cracked, fully open, both halves pushed back against the outer wall, as though whoever had opened them had wanted to leave no ambiguity about their openness. Lamplight spilled from within. Warm, amber, steady, the light of oil lamps that had been tended, that had been refilled when they grew low, that had been kept burning with conscious attention rather than left to gutter out. The light fell out through the open doors and made a golden shape on the cobblestones of the square, a warm rectangle that looked almost inviting against the blue dark of the evening outside. "The big one is with them," the woman said. "He hasn't left since the second night." The pack stirred. The movement ran through them like a current, not aggressive, not the preparatory stirring of dragons about to act, but something more involuntary than that. The sound and the meaning of the big one reached them all at essentially the same moment and produced essentially the same response, which was the response of 14 creatures suddenly uncertain about something they had been certain of a moment before. Wings shifted. Heads moved. Someone at the back of the formation, Vrath, he knew without looking. Because Vrath was always somewhere between composed and not, made a sound low in her throat that was not quite a growl and not quite a question. Korath raised one claw. The pack stilled. Not immediately, there was a half-second of continued motion before the command registered and compliance followed, which told him the pack was more unsettled than they were letting the humans see. But they stilled. They held. 14 red dragons in the village square breathing carefully and watching their alpha to see what he would do next. He moved toward the buildings. The doorway was not built for him. This was not a surprise. Very little in human settlements was built for him, and he had stopped being surprised by this the way one stops being surprised by low doorways once one has lived long enough. The frame was wide by human standards, the opening perhaps wide enough for 3 large men to walk abreast, but Korath was not 3 large men, and the height of the lintel would have caught him at roughly mid-chest had he attempted to enter in any orthodox fashion. He did not attempt to enter in any orthodox fashion. He removed the upper portion of the doorframe the way one removes an obstacle, with efficient, targeted force and no particular malice. His right forelimb moved once, a controlled downward and outward motion, and the timber of the upper frame cracked and gave and came away in 2 sections that he set aside rather than dropped because dropping them inside might disturb whatever was within. And he was already, without having seen what was within, without fully knowing why, taking care about disturbance. The motion was precise and unhurried, not angry, not violent in the way that violence carries heat and emotion, simply the removal of a physical constraint by the most efficient means available. He ducked inside and stopped. The stopping was not a decision. It was not the product of thought or assessment or the conscious processing of information. It was the involuntary locking of his body at the moment his eyes delivered their report to his mind, and his mind required more time than expected to understand what it was looking at. Not because the scene was complex, because it was the last thing. The absolute last thing. On a wide bed of straw and folded blankets in the far corner, the kind of arrangement made by someone working with available materials and real intent, the straw fluffed and layered for softness beneath the blankets. The blankets themselves old and slightly mismatched, but clean and clearly chosen for their weight. A human man lay sleeping on his back. He was large by human standards, which were the only standards immediately applicable to the assessment, though in absolute terms he was still much smaller than the smallest adult in Korath's pack. Broad across the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes from physical work done consistently over many years rather than the kind of deliberate physical culture that some humans apparently pursued for its own sake. Dark hair grown past the point where it had been intentional and into the territory of someone who had been too occupied with other things to manage it. His face in sleep had lost the organization that waking faces maintain, the assembled readiness, the continual slight adjustments of expression that mark a face as occupied, and had gone slack and young in the way that sleep does to all faces regardless of what they are in waking hours. His hands rested at his sides, palms slightly upward, fingers loosely curled. They were the hands of someone who worked with them, calloused across the palm, scarred at 2 knuckles on the right with the particular blunt-fingered broadness of hands that have been used hard and often. Even in sleep they were still. Not tense, not fidgeting, still with the completeness of profound exhaustion. He was deeply, thoroughly, completely asleep. Not the light sleep of someone uncomfortable in their surroundings, not the surface sleep of a person who has gone unconscious from stress and might surface again at any sound. This was the sleep at the bottom, the kind that a body falls into when it has spent days refusing to fall and has finally been overruled by its own necessity. The kind of sleep that does not hear the world and would not apologize for not hearing it. The kind that had been earned. Across him, arranged with the total unconcerned authority of small creatures who have evaluated their sleeping surface and found it entirely satisfactory, were 3 hatchlings. Korath saw Pyron first because Pyron was on the man's chest, and the man's chest rose and fell with each slow breath, and the movement caught the eye before anything else did. She was curled in a tight circle nose to tail tip, the compact sleeping posture she had never quite grown into as reliably as the other 2, because Pyron's resting state even in sleep tended toward coiled readiness rather than full relaxation. But she was relaxed now. Her chin rested on her own tail, and her scales caught the lamplight and threw it back in the particular deep copper red of a young red, whose colors were still finding their final depth. She rose and fell with the man's breathing as though she had synchronized herself to it, as though his rhythm had become hers while she slept. And the sight of it, the sight of Pyron, who trusted nothing easily, breathing in time with a sleeping human, was the first crack in the wall of Korath's 4-day certainty about what he had come here to do. Salt was under the man's left arm. Salt had, with the characteristic determination that had earned him his name, wedged himself into the space between the man's arm and his side with the thoroughness of something that has found a warm corner and has no intention of leaving it. His snout was pressed against the man's ribs, pressed, not resting, the deliberate contact of a hatchling who has found a source of warmth and sound and is staying close to both. His eyes were shut so completely that his face had taken on a smooth, sealed quality. He was not going to wake up for anything less than a significant geological event, and possibly not for that. And Thessaly. Korath looked at Thessaly for a long time. Thessaly was sprawled across the man's legs with the absolute boneless total contentment of a creature who has arrived somewhere and stopped. Not settled, arrived. There is a difference between an animal that has settled for a sleeping place and an animal that has decided it has found its sleeping place, and Thessaly's posture communicated the latter with a completeness that left no room for alternate interpretation. She was on her back, partially. One wing half open, trailing off the man's shin onto the blankets below. Her neck was arched backward in the specific position that dragons of any age only adopt when they are not only asleep but safe. Because it is an exposed position, the throat presented upward, the most vulnerable line of a dragon's body offered to the open air without reservation. Thessaly, who watched before she moved. Thessaly, who had taken longer than any of them to decide about anything. Thessaly, who had in her young life never once willingly approached an unfamiliar thing without first cataloging it from the maximum safe distance. Thessaly had decided. All 3 of them were breathing slowly. All 3 of them were warm. He could feel the heat of them from the doorway, the particular warmth of healthy young dragons who have been well-fed and sufficiently rested, a warmth that was slightly above ambient temperature and very slightly above the warmth of the man they were sleeping on. All 3 of them were whole. He looked for damage. He could not help it. The looking was not a choice but a reflex, the immediate inventory that a parent runs when reunited with a child after absence, the eyes moving fast and cataloging before the heart has fully processed the fact of the reunion. He looked at Pyron's wings, intact. At Salt's tail, intact, no cuts, no unusual angles. At Thessaly's scales along her spine, undisturbed, uniformly present, nothing pried or missing. And then he saw Pyron's left forepaw. There was bandaging on it. Clean cloth wrapped with care, changed recently from the fresh white of it, not the original dressing this, but a replacement. Someone had rewrapped it. Beneath the cloth he could see the slight puffing of a healing wound, and when he breathed in carefully with his attention directed at her specifically, he caught the faint herbal trace of something, a poultice, something green and astringent, applied beneath the bandage to prevent infection. Someone had cleaned the wound. Someone had treated it. Someone had then wrapped it. and then at some later point yesterday he thought, from the freshness of the cloth, someone had unwrapped it, assessed it, cleaned it again, and rewrapped it with fresh material. His eyes moved to the floor beside the bed. The floor told the story that the scene itself only implied. There was a bowl on the floor, wide, ceramic, made for a purpose other than this purpose but conscripted. It had held water. He could see the dried ring of residue at its edges, the faint mineral stain of water that had sat and slowly evaporated, and from the depth of the stain it had been filled and emptied multiple times. Filled, offered, emptied by hatchlings who had been thirsty, filled again. Beside it, a smaller vessel, the same story. Both of them licked to clean smoothness on the inside surface, hatchlings who had been fed. There were scraps of cloth on the floor near the bowl. Not rags, not the casual discard of someone who had grabbed the nearest available material, but cut cloth, cut with intent, cut to width and length for a specific purpose, and the purpose was bandaging. Several pieces of it, some used and discarded, some folded and waiting. Someone had torn up something of their own to provide this, or had gone and found material and cut it, and had done so more than once. The man's coat was not on the man. It was draped over Salt and Thessaly, over Salt who was tucked under the man's arm, and over Thessaly on his legs, spread as a blanket, an extra layer of warmth. The man's own outer garment given to the hatchlings because the hatchlings were small and the building was large and someone had decided the hatchlings should be warmer. It was a heavy coat, well worn, the kind a working man in a cold season region relies on as equipment rather than wears as fashion. And it was gone from its owner and given to the small ones, and the man lay beneath it only by proximity, sharing its warmth as a consequence of what was sleeping on top of him rather than for his own benefit. Korath looked at the man's face again. At the darkness under his eyes, visible even in sleep, that specific bruised quality of skin that has been stretched thin over exhaustion, the body's honest accounting of what it has been through. At the set of his shoulders, which even in the deepest sleep held a particular tension, not the tension of discomfort. The tension of someone who had spent days holding very still, making themselves a stable and unmoving surface, suppressing every ordinary small movement of sleep, the shifting, the turning, the unconscious adjustments, so as not to disturb what was resting on them. The tension of someone who had still been performing that service even while unconscious, whose body had learned the stillness so thoroughly that it maintained it without instruction. He had been here since the second night, 2 full days and 2 full nights and the better part of 2 days more. He had stayed. He had not left when the hatchlings were sleeping and he might have slipped away unnoticed. He had not sent them out and locked the door when the fear of what was coming became real and present and hard to ignore. He had stayed. He had filled the bowl and changed the bandage and given them his coat and talked to them. Korath found himself certain of this last detail without being told, certain in the way one is certain of things that follow logically from the full weight of evidence, that this man had talked to the hatchlings, had let his voice be the continuous signal that said safe, warm, still here, and he had stayed. Behind Korath, pressed as close to the ruined doorway as they could manage, the rest of the pack had gathered. He could feel them, their presence, their attention, their collective attempt to understand why the Alpha had stopped moving. He could feel Vrath in particular, her anxious alertness, her relief at the smell of the hatchlings warring with her uncertainty about everything else. He did not turn to address them. He did not need to. He understood that what he did in the next moments would tell them everything they needed to know about how to interpret what they were seeing. He stood in the ruined doorway and looked at his 3 hatchlings sleeping on a human man who had earned his exhaustion in their service, and he let the rage that had carried him down from the mountains do what it had been threatening to do for the last 60 seconds, which was to run out of anywhere to go. It did not disappear. Rage of that size and duration does not simply disappear. It turned over slowly, heavily, like something very large in water that is too shallow for it, and it settled, and it went still, and what was left after it settled was not the emptiness he might have expected, but something older and quieter and considerably harder to name. And then Thessaly opened one eye. One golden eye, catching the lamplight, blinking once with the slow and thorough blink of a creature surfacing very briefly from deep water. She looked at Korath with that one eye. She took him in the ruined doorframe, the enormous familiar presence of her Alpha filling the space where the doorframe had been, the rest of the pack pressing in behind him. She assessed all of this information with the characteristic Thessaly thoroughness, which even at this age and even mostly asleep took very little time, because Thessaly had always processed quickly. She yawned. It was a slow yawn, an enormous yawn for a creature of her current size, her jaw opening to the full extent of its considerable hinge and staying there for a long, luxurious moment, every small sharp tooth presented to the lamplight with the total absence of self-consciousness that belongs only to the very young, the very safe, and the very certain that they are both. She held the yawn until it had finished doing what it needed to do. Then she closed her mouth. Then she looked at Korath again for a moment with that same single golden eye, communicating something that required no translation in any language, draconic or otherwise. She was fine, they were all fine. She was aware of where she was and she was remaining there, and the Alpha's presence was noted and appreciated, but was not, under the current circumstances, sufficient reason to move. Then she closed the eye, tucked her snout back under the man's knee with the deliberate care of someone resettling a preferred pillow, and went back to sleep. Korath stood in the ruined doorway. After a long moment, he withdrew. Korath withdrew from the doorway slowly. Not in retreat, never that, but with the deliberate caution of a creature who understood that a single careless movement could break something fragile, something that could not be remade once shattered. The old wood of the building creaked faintly as he shifted his weight back. The scent of it lingered in his lungs. Smoke, damp stone, old grain, human breath, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the thin, bright warmth of hatchlings. Alive, all three. He stepped clear of the threshold and into the open air of the square. The village was waiting. It had the stillness of a held breath stretched too long. Even the wind seemed reluctant to cross the open space, as though it too understood that this was a moment balanced on the edge of something irreversible. The old man with the staff stood at the front of the gathered villagers. His hands were steady, though his knuckles had gone pale around the worn wood. Beside him, the woman with flowers still dusted across her forearms had not moved from where she had been when the dragons arrived. The white powder marked her like some quiet declaration that she had been doing something ordinary when the extraordinary came and had chosen not to run. Behind them, the rest of the village formed a loose half-circle. 100 heartbeats, 100 held breaths. And opposite them, the pack. They were spread across the square and the rooftops and the low stone walls, filling the space with a presence that was both weight and absence. Wings folded, tails stilled, eyes fixed on their alpha. Waiting. Not restless, not impatient. Waiting. For him. Korath let the silence stretch. He could feel it in them, the tension wound tight beneath their stillness. The readiness. The instinct that had carried them across mountains and through storms and into battles that left valleys burned and enemies reduced to ash. They had come for their youngs. They had expected. No, they had prepared. For something else. He turned his head slightly, letting his gaze sweep across them without moving his body. A signal? Not yet. The tension held. Then he turned back to the old man. How long has he been in there? His voice was low, but it always carried. The elder swallowed, though his posture did not waver. Since the first night, he said. Carefully. Every word placed with the precision of a man who knew that truth was the only coin worth offering here, and that even truth might not be enough. We found the little ones in the river, he continued. The current had them, they came down from the high pass during the rainstorm. Korath's gaze flicked just briefly toward the distant mountains, now dark against the fading sky. The storm, yes, he remembered it, the kind that tore nests from cliffside holds and scattered what it could not destroy. Marin pulled 2 of them out himself, the elder said, and went back for the third. A pause. He had them warm and settled before any of us understood what they were. The silence deepened. We understood by the second morning. Korath let that settle. The weight of that understanding. The fear that must have followed. And he stayed, Korath said. The woman answered this time. He was afraid to move them. Her voice had changed. It had lost its earlier tightness, its edge of fear. There was something steadier in it now, something that had grown in the long hours of waiting. He said if he moved and one of them woke frightened, something might happen to the village. A flicker crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not. He thought it was better to wait. Better to wait. Korath considered that. The choice. Not to run. Not to hide. Not to abandon what had been found. But to stay. To wait. He's been awake for most of it, she added. He only went under this evening. A murmur almost imperceptible passed through the pack. Not sound. Understanding. Shared. Korath was quiet for a long moment. Then, the small one's forepaw, he said. The elder nodded. River rock, Marin cleaned it and wrapped it. He was very careful. A hesitation. And then, because this was a man who had survived long enough to understand the value of completeness. He talked to them. Korath's gaze sharpened just slightly. Through all of it, the elder went on. We could hear him. He didn't know what he was saying or if they could understand, but he talked to them anyway. A faint, almost disbelieving exhale. About nothing, about the weather, the harvest, a horse he had as a boy. The elder looked toward the doorway as though he could still hear it. They settled whenever he did. Silence again. But it was no longer the same silence. Something had shifted. Among the pack, heads tilted, wings adjusted, tails eased against stone. A language without words. Korath lowered himself. Fully. The motion was slow, deliberate, the great weight of him settling onto the cobblestones with a deep, grounding sound, like earth remembering its shape after a tremor. Not a strike posture. Not dominance. Something else. Something older. Something rarer. We will wait, he said. And so they did. The red dragon pack settled into the village square like a storm that had chosen, inexplicably, to become rain. At first, no one moved. The villagers held themselves as they had been, rigid, braced, caught between fear and disbelief. Dragons, 14 of them, in their square. Not burnings, not tearing, waiting. Time stretched. Then slowly, a shift. A child moved first. Only a step, only a small one. But it was enough. The spell broke just slightly. A woman reached for a water bucket she had dropped earlier. A man bent to right an overturned cart. Someone whispered something too quiet to carry, and someone else answered. Life, stubborn and ordinary, began to resume. Carefully, cautiously, but undeniably. Someone brought water. They did not approach too closely. They set the bucket at the edge of the open space and retreated, eyes lowered, movements measured. No one stopped them. A younger member of the pack, barely beyond hatchlinghood, watched the bucket with open curiosity, her head tilted, her nostrils flared. She did not move toward it. But the interest was there. Not hunger. Something else. Later, someone else came. An older woman this time, carrying a woven basket. She did not look at the dragons. Not once. She crossed the square with the deliberate focus of someone performing a necessary task, set the basket down near the same edge, and turned back the way she had come. Only once she had reached the safety of the gathered villagers did she allow herself to breathe. Inside the basket, salted fish. The scent carried. Sharp, strong, unmistakable. A ripple passed through the pack. Korath did not move. But one of the older dragons, scarred along one flank, her wings bearing the marks of long years, shifted her gaze toward him. Permission. Korath exhaled slowly. A plume of heat that did not become flame. Wait. And so they did. The offering remained untouched. But it was acknowledged. In the way of creatures who understood that some gestures mattered, even when they were not accepted. The light faded. Day gave way to dusk and dusk to night. The sky deepened into a dark, endless blue, scattered with the first hard points of starlight. Still they waited. Time moved differently now. Measured not in moments but in breaths. In the quiet shift of weight. In the steady rise and fall of chests. In the distant sound of something within the building. It came suddenly. Sharp, bright, a chirp. Small, but unmistakable. Every dragon in the square went still. Not a muscle moved. Not a wing stirred. But the stillness was no longer passive. It was focused. A second chirp. Then a third. Higher, stronger, more insistent. Alive. Awake. Inside the building, something shifted. A soft human sound, low, rough with exhaustion. A voice. Murmurings. Calm. Steady. Words too quiet to carry clearly, but the cadence of them, unhurried, grounding, familiar. Then, 3 voices answering at once. The hatchlings. The sound cut through the square like light. Korath closed his eyes. Just for a moment. And in that moment, everything he had not allowed himself to feel since the storm broke across the high pass came rushing back. The empty nest. The broken stone. The absence. The knowledge. Too familiar. of what it meant when the young were lost. And then, this, alive, safe, not alone. Something rose in his chest, too large, too complex for the shapes his kind had given to feeling. It was relief, yes, but sharpened by the knowledge of how close it had come to being something else. He breathed in, held it, let it go. When he opened his eyes again, the world had settled into something steadier. Not unchanged, but resolved. Inside movement. Then, the man. He appeared in the ruined doorway slowly, as though uncertain what he would find beyond it. And then he saw them. All 14. Filling his village. The square. The rooftops. The night itself. He went very, very still. The hatchlings did not. They climbed over him with the uncoordinated certainty of creatures who had not yet learned fear. One perched on his shoulder, claws catching in worn fabric. Another clung to his back, wings half open for balance. The third, Thessaly, had somehow made her way onto his head and was, with great determination, attempting to eat his hair. The man did not seem to notice. Or perhaps he did, and had decided that there were larger concerns. A soft chirp came from his left. Pyrans, impatient. She nudged her head against his jaw. He looked down at her, then up, at Chorus. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was not large, but it held everything. Korath regarded him. This human, large for his kind, broad-shouldered, calloused hands, eyes lined with exhaustion. 3 days without proper rest. 3 days of staying, waiting, talking, not knowing, and still, he had stayed. You kept them warm, Korath said. The man swallowed. I tried to. You kept them whole. A pause. A breath. Oh yes. Korath inclined his head. A small motion. But for a creature like him, it was enormous. Then you are known to us, he said. The words carried differently now. Not as a warning. Not as a threat. But as something else. Something that would travel. In all mountains, in all passes, in all places where the red pack flies. He held the man's gaze. So that he would understand. So that it would remain. You will not be forgotten. The man opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Whatever words he might have found. They were interrupted. Pyron sneezed. A small, bright jet of flame burst from her snout and landed directly on the top of his head. For a single suspended instant. Nothing happened. Then, smoke. The man yelped a short, startled sound and slapped at his hair, which had begun very faintly to smolder. The hatchlings scattered in delighted alarm. Thessaly lost her footing and slid down his back, chirping indignantly. Pyron made a sound that was unmistakably pleased with herself. And somewhere in the square, a sound, soft, unexpected, a breath that became something more. The youngest member of the pack, barely older than the hatchlings themselves, let out a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. It broke the moment. Not entirely, but enough. Enough that the tension which had held so tightly for so long finally began to loosen. The man, still patting his hair, looked up again. And this time, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not just fear, not just awe, something else. Understanding. Perhaps not complete. Perhaps not yet. But enough. Enough to stand. Enough to meet the gaze of a dragon and not look away. Around them, the village breathed again. And the pack remained for a little while longer. Not as conquerors. Not as a reckoning. But as something far rarer. Witnesses. And the night, which had arrived heavy with the promise of fire and ruin, passed instead into something quieter. Something stranger. Something that would be told and retold, until memory became story and story became something like truth. A night when dragons came for vengeance, and chose instead to remember.